What up, TCK Potters? Welcome back to the program. I'm your host, Sky Guasco, with my man, Bobby Lamarco. We got another quick hitter for you. We are talking about Austin Ekeler, another running back steal. If you missed our video on Jonathan Taylor, you can find it right here on the channel. If you have not yet subscribed to the Fantasy Focused YouTube channel, you can do that right now. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitch, and Twitter. These episodes are not available via podcast. Long episodes of all of the breakdown for the running back steals from 2021 recap available on the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast, anywhere the Believe Podcast Network is heard, but these quick hitters only available on YouTube. I'm going to kick it over to Bob for a quick 2021 recap, and then I'll dive into some 2022 talk. We're talking Austin Ekeler of the Los Angeles Chargers.
Yeah, so we're doing how to find steals in your fantasy football draft, and we're kind of taking a look at every RB steal. Me and Buck did a more extensive lift. Me and Sky just did JT. Now we're talking Austin Ekeler. Now for Ekeler, when it comes down to it, listen, I got to say this podcast, we nailed it last offseason. We both were very high on Ekeler. The JT podcast was us shaming each other. The Ekeler podcast is us congratulating each other. So today was a nice balance of what were we thinking, and then we got one. So Ekeler, his ADP was about 9.5 on pretty much all sites, right? 9.5 ADP for RBs. He finished points per game, RB3, and overall second. But when you start looking at his consistency rankings, what I do is I like to look at points. So what I did last podcast, I talked through this. An elite running back averaged in the game 21 points. Ekeler was sixth in the NFL in elite points in games, 31% of his games. Second in RB1 finishes, which is 14 points per game at 75% of his games, or at least 14 points, which is just phenomenal. But he was first in RB2. He actually passed JT in RB2 games, which is 11.7 points per game, 87.5% of his games. Now, there's a couple things that before we start getting excited about Ekeler's future, we have to take a look at what made him a true X factor this year compared to previous years. The first thing is his touches. 224 was his previous career high. That skyrockets to 276. He's finally healthy. He plays 16 games. He's also outside of Melvin Gordon's shadow while healthy, which has led to this huge spike in touches. The second factor was his touchdowns. He scored a touchdown on 7.2% of his touches. That was the second highest rate in the NFL. League average is 3%. So prior to this season, his career average for percent of touches that were touchdowns was 4.4%. So if we actually factor in that natural regression, and I've talked about this on a podcast with Buck, when you're at 6.5% or higher, you have a 90% chance of falling by 2%. So that's essentially 2 touchdowns for every 100 touches. So Ekeler is most likely going to regress in touchdowns. Based on his career averages, he would lose about 3 points per game. Still elite. That would have been RB4 in 2020 and RB8 in 2019 and 2018. So plenty of room for Ekeler to be very good next season, even if he regresses in touchdowns. Now, like we talked about in previous podcasts, we like to look at the things that changed in the offseason, preseason 2021. The first was the offensive line. They get Corey Linsley, the center, PFF's number 1 center in 2019. He comes over. They draft Rashad Slater in the first round at left tackle. He's a stud. Matt Filer, the guard from Pittsburgh, comes over. He plays very well for them. So they anchored that offensive line. So that really helped. And PFF had them ranked in the middle of the pack at 18. And then sure enough, by the end of the season, they improved dramatically. They also brought in Joe Lombardi. And Joe Lombardi, Saints QB coach, and me and you talked about this a bunch. We said he's got the Alvin Kamara stuff going on. Ekeler, that comparison is perfect. And sure enough, he was great in the passing game, but he was used in the red zone. I mean, his red zone usage, his touchdowns, his goal line work, he got it all with Lombardi. So that was very exciting. So what we like to do is that's kind of the stuff that we saw early on. But Scott, give us an outlook for 2022 and possibly a player who could be next year's Austin Ekeler.
Man, it does feel good to talk about a player that we hit, and we weren't alone. I mean, Austin Ekeler was definitely a player among the fantasy community that a lot of people thought could be straight up like the number 1 guy if he stayed healthy and the cookie crumbled. He ended up finishing number 2 in PPR. And look, man, he had a career high across the board. All right. Finally saw that goal line work that we were kind of waiting for, and he hadn't gotten yet. Finally saw the goal line work. Justin Herbert, not only an elite downfield passer, also a very intelligent, smart passer, checked down a lot more than I think we expected. Ekeler finally stayed healthy. This is huge. Second time in his career, he's played 16 games. Now, of course, we play 17 now, so he did miss one game, but he was there for 16 games. Ultimately, with running backs, especially, Bob, if you can play 12 games, you're probably top 10, and then it just kind of figures out from there. But he played very well, and you mentioned it. I won't go back through it again, but the biggest upgrade was the offensive line. The Chargers were not messing around. They fixed the offensive line, drafted Slater, who some had higher than my boy Penei Sewell. They got Slater, and that was huge out of Northwestern. And then, again, as you mentioned, the Austin Ekeler, Alvin Kamara effect with Joe Lombardi. Everything hit for Austin Ekeler, which is great. Now, like I said with Jonathan Taylor in the previous video, it's all good to say this stuff, but that's why we do recaps. Can he repeat what he did last year? Now, something I look at pretty much every time when I'm at the top and I'm looking at pass catching backs. This isn't something I would look for or look at when I'm maybe grading a guy like let's say Damian Harris, for example. Not really a pass catching back. I'm not going to look at how many targets he had. It's not part of his game. It's different, right? Derrick Henry, same thing. But Austin Ekeler, right? It matters when you're at the top. Now, Austin Ekeler had, and this is by 0.1, there were only 2 running backs in the NFL that had 0.1 more targets per game played. Surprisingly, Leonard Fournette led the NFL with 6 targets per game, which is incredible with Tom Brady. And then Deandre Swift, Alvin Kamara, and Christian McCaffrey were tied in second place with 5.9 targets per game. Now, that's huge. Okay, if he can continue to get that, I love that moving forward because, again, that's already been his floor with the receiving work, and now we're going to get a rush yard. Now, again, I said career highs across the board. He did. He had basically about 70 more attempts than he's ever had on the ground, 350 more rushing yards. I'm kind of rounding these numbers off. Surprisingly, he had his worst yards per carry average, 4.4. He's been closer like 4.6, 5.2, 5.5. And then he had 70 receptions, which is the second highest outside of that 92 catches he had a couple years ago, and only 600 receiving yards, which is really great. But he had nearly 1,000 2 years ago, but 20 touchdowns, Bob. 20 touchdowns. Massive, right? Alvin Kamara, Dalvin Cook, who we talked about in the last show, plummeted in touchdowns, and it matters with fantasy points. But you get that 20 touchdowns, even double digits, that was massive. So he's number 2. Now, can he compete it? Or can he repeat it next year? Absolutely, I think he can. Justin Jackson was fun for the game that Austin Ekeler missed. They brought in 2 or 3 rookies in the last couple of years who have been good until they get the opportunity to shine, and they haven't really been able to shine, unfortunately. Now, one thing that I don't think terribly plummets Ekeler's value, but is something to consider and just kind of monitor moving forward, Mike Williams, who was on his 5th-year deal. There was talks that he might get released last year. They might not pick up his 5th-year option. He might get traded. He might, he's a free agent, whatever. All of a sudden, there's talks coming out, from The Athletic. The Chargers reporter comes out and says they're looking for wide receiver 1 type money because he's a wide receiver 1 type talent. Now, I love my Clemson receivers. I love Mike Williams. I don't know that he's going to get paid as a number 1. Nonetheless, if he goes, they might bring someone else in, but that's huge for Ekeler, just more targets. If he stays, we already know what the ceiling can be. So that's going to be, I think, a differentiator potentially come this August. Now, finally, do I have a player comp for Austin Ekeler? We talked last video. Again, if you haven't seen it yet, click up on our channel here for Jonathan Taylor. We had a comp to Jonathan Taylor. I brought up Najee Harris for who could maybe be the number 1 overall guy and with the same skill set and all that with Jonathan Taylor. Now, when you're talking Austin Ekeler, you have to look at a very specialized back that can catch the ball like a receiver. Alvin Kamara, right, would be a comp. I'm going to go with Deandre Swift. And Deandre Swift is actually a player that I faded last year. And of course, I'm kicking my own ass now because of what happened with the talent. But at the same time, I don't regret, like Jonathan Taylor, who I faded by like 3 spots. But because of that, he's a first-round pick. I didn't have any of them. I'm not so disappointed in my process. The process for me was right on DeAndre Swift. He just got healthier, and he was just straight up used more in that offense than I thought he would be with Anthony Lynn. Now, Anthony Lynn comes over to my Niners, so we'll see what happens with Jamal Williams and DeAndre Swift in Detroit next year. But skill set wise, I do think that DeAndre Swift has an opportunity. And again, if I'm talking about targets, which is huge in PPR especially, and to get up to the top there, I mentioned 2 running backs, Bob, that had more targets per game than Austin Ekeler last year. Leonard Fournette with the Tom Brady, James White dump down factor, and DeAndre Swift. Now, DeAndre Swift missed 4 games. That's a problem, right? But he had 11 targets in week 1, 10 targets in week 7. He had multiple games of 6+ targets, which is similar to Austin Ekeler. So if the Lions can take a step up behind an improved offensive line with Sewell and Decker, which I think that they will, Goff can play just not horribly, and they can continue to fight and move that ball. I'm not as worried about Jamal Williams this year as I was last year. He can't prove to stay healthy. So if Swift can give me, 12, 13 games, I think he has an opportunity to be a top 5 back. If he gives us 15 plus games, I think Swift straight up could be top 3, maybe a top back overall if he can get, 15 total scores. Mute.
The Swift thing you just brought up, I absolutely love Swift. I love that because Dan Campbell and Joe Lombardi coach together. They both come from New Orleans. Yep. But on top of that, I just saw it with Swift, and I agree. Now, when it comes to player potential change in offense, like Ekeler benefited from Lombardi coming in and becoming giving him the ball and featuring his running backs in the passing game, and also providing some, Alvin Kamara comparisons. Now, if I was looking at a coaching change that I really like and what he could bring to a running back, it's Saquon Barkley. I think Brian Daboll coming in here. Listen, I know the Bills' running game wasn't elite, but we saw when they committed to Devin Singletary that last 7 games. I mean, we're talking 19 points per game. Barkley was still good last year when he was actually given the ball. They just cut him. They basically cut him by the knees. They only played him in a certain amount of games, over 75% of snaps, 17 touches in a game. When he was getting that level of work, he was still a low-end RB1 in those games. I think Brian Daboll comes in and does big stuff for Saquon. So early on, that's kind of my comp when it comes to the coaching change, the impact the coach can have on a running back, like Lombardi did for Austin Ekeler. Well, that's it, folks. That's how we do it here. Real quick, real easy. Breaking down how to find steals in your fantasy draft. Once again, I'm Bobby Lamarco. This is the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast, joined by my co-host, Sky Gawasco. All our podcasts are on the Believe Podcast Network and brought to you by BetOnline AG. Now, Sky, anything you else want to say to the people before we go?
If Austin Ekeler can give us 13 plus touchdowns, he's still top 5. He's going to be in my top 5 come August. Stay tuned.
All right. I'm Bobby. That's Sky. We're out of here.